And Kerry said the same thing. I mean, when the BBC in their usual, like they're absolutely hidebound, the BBC. I can't understand it.
No.
But anyway, they said, oh, well, you're saying all this, but of course China is the big villain in the room and so on. And Kerry said, no, I don't accept that. They're doing more than any other country in the world.
I think Kerry sounded very good. And I think that this is the other thing. We need to get to people like Kerry. We need to get to the influencers in the room, and we need to get you in the room, really, basically.
Well,
because
I was hoping to talk to what's that young lady from Scandinavia?
Oh yeah, I can't remember her name. Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, exactly. And I think
yes, Greta Thunberg. I was really liking, because she's really missed a huge trick. If she spent an hour with a graphic designer and did some pie charts or graphs of the relative expenditure of the world on weapons, the arms trade, and on dealing with climate change or dealing with world water problems or with world health, I mean, she would just blow them away, because what it would show, I mean, the ratio between, for example, an annual expenditure on weapons and defense and annual expenditure of the World Health Organization is 1 to 360. So 360 times as much is spent on killing each other or trying to kill each other or preparing to kill each other as on World WHO. So if she said, look, this is nonsense, either we take this seriously and we deal with climate change and these other health problems and so on, or we're not interested. If we're interested, we reduce world expenditure by a certain percentage a year, 5% a year, 10% a year. 5% of the budget would quadruple the WHO expenditure. 5% the next year would make clean water for the world. 5% the next year would educate women throughout the world. And if you went down to even just half of what we now spend, instead of 1.7 trillion, and it would make the world safer rather than less safe. So, she had something like that. Now, that was just at the top of my mind at the moment. It's just extraordinary how we just don't take the important things seriously, and we take this nonsense of warfare. And I mean, in the climate of post-Afghanistan, for the 150th time, the Americans should have realized the errors of their way. But anyway, returning to what you were saying before, I think one thing that struck me is you said a lot of your young friends were becoming Buddhists. I think that is also another factor in our favor. I mean, I think people under, I don't know what age, but say 30 or 25, live in a different and much more global and tolerant and internationally interested world. You can see it in race relations. These are the ones who just are mostly colorblind in this country. They just don't notice that people are from different. But those of us, and of course I can see it around my friends, those of us over the age of, say, 40 or 50, we were brought up in the Cold War. We were brought up with hating China, and we were brought up with this and that and the other thing. It's very difficult to shift those people. But younger people, I mean, my granddaughters, if you said, China's no threat, they'd say, well, who says it's a threat? Of course not. I mean, I have lots of Chinese friends and so on and so on. So we can certainly, and that's why a lot of my books, as you notice, are for young, directed at the young.
And also they're written, they're very, very clear. And I mean, one of the things that you write about your discipline, education, was how to write well. And I mean, and I think I've said before, I was reading your essays that you were doing at university. I mean, I couldn't write those now. I mean, thousands. I mean, they're brilliant and long. I mean, but I think that's the good thing, that they're very clear and they're very readable, and they're not swamped by footnotes. There are footnotes, but you can just read, and it's just a pleasure to read them. And I think that's important. I think you've got a great style, and I think it's a very appealing style. It's very straight. It tells you what you need to know. It doesn't get bogged down in detail or you know, there's this, there's that, the other. Because this is the other problem with a lot of the way philosophy is written these days. In order to get the argument, you've got to cover all the arguments. So there'll be 10 points that they have to dismiss before they can actually make their own point. And that there's nothing wrong with that, except that it makes it very difficult and quite boring to read. And you don't do that. And I think that's a real gift. And I think obviously you've worked at it, so it's not really a gift, it's what you've trained yourself to be able to do. But I think that works as well. And I've got 2 daughters, and they're down here for the holiday, and they've both got partners. One of them is a historian, one's in real estate. And I keep just shoveling the stuff at them, and they love it. They're very sympathetic to it, and they like it. And they say, we weren't taught any of this stuff. Why don't we know this? I mean, I said, I don't know. I wasn't taught it either. Well, so I think this is quite an interesting, I think we're at a very interesting point, an interesting time. And I think in just putting out, how do we actually then sell this stuff? I think that's not me saying, I don't know whether we're going to be able to do it. I think we will. I think, though, it is through social media sites. I think also there are all sorts of now interesting conferences around climate change and around things that really are getting the public, especially the young people, very exercised. And climate change is the biggie. And arms and getting rid of the arms industry, that's another biggie. And I think that's where we need to that's where we can wedge this stuff in, because I think it really gives them the deep background to what's actually happening, rather than having to deal with just the surface politics. It's a bit like what you were saying in one of your interviews earlier. You know, if you want to solve a problem, don't solve it at the level of that it's appearing. You've got to go deeper or higher. You've got to go to a different level. And I think that's what you're doing with your work. You're giving people the underpinning of understanding where they really are.
Yes, Einstein. I mean, in terms of style, I owe a lot of it, obviously, to my teachers, as you saw, and particularly Keith Thomas. And I mean, what one hopes to emulate is obviously George Orwell, who wrote about simple style and so on. And one or two of the people who've reviewed my books have said, no, it is written similarly to, and of course, George Orwell was an amazing stylist of that kind, like Hazlitt and one or two others. But of course, he died young, so he got inside the whale, as it were, but then he died. And he didn't have, therefore, the advantage, which, thanks to modern medicine and Sarah and the rest I have, which is to keep going on. Because a lot of all this stuff, as I said in one of my talks, climbing the mountain, only becomes clear after a long time and experience and thinking. So if one could possibly be George Orwell living to 80, or in their 70s, imagine what he might have written.
Or Hazlitt, because Hazlitt died young, didn't he? I mean, he was on the edge.
Well, he was a wonderful stylist as well. So it's really, if one can speak directly to people, put a young person in front of you. That's why these books are written to young people, because in each case there is a person there, a child of one of my friends usually, and I'm trying to say to you, look, it's quite simple. This is how it is. I mean, of course, it can be extremely annoying. I remember being rather amused and touched by someone coming up after one of my lectures in anthropology saying, Dr. Macfarlane, you make it sound so simple. And I can't see the counter arguments, but you're oversimplifying, etc., etc. You know, they were quite upset because they were probably very left wing, and I was sort of giving the middle position, and they couldn't see what was wrong with me, and so they were a bit frustrated. And that may again relate to the American anti-relativism thing, because there is a really deep problem, which is if you're dealing with, particularly in America, a monotheistic Calvinist tradition, certainly in the white population. And if you're dealing at a low level with the problem I've seemed to have detected with Ernest Gellner, that once there are a whole set of foundational theoretical bases that you have derived from Western philosophy and Western religion and monotheism and so on and so on and so on. If you start challenging them, and this relates back to one of the hidden injuries, which is the pain of the open society. I mean, it's something that someone Ernest admired, and I did, an African anthropologist called Robin Horton, and he wrote a couple of articles on the open society in which he pointed out that it was vaguely philosophical. He worked in Ghana or Nigeria, and basically from the Renaissance onwards, we have lived in this open environment where there is no truth, there is no final arbiter or anything else, which relates back to that post-string. I mean, it's a very old observation, and it's built actually into much earlier philosophy in the West. But basically, trying to live in a world where you have philosophical doubt of a serious kind is not easy. It requires a certain maturity and self-confidence. And so people who've been brought up in some Midwest American thing, and they're suddenly told that, you know, things are not quite as certain as they like to believe, might well feel threatened and reject it. So you've got to approach it pretty carefully.